So I thought the best way to begin would be with some music. And I just wanted to say, apropos, your kind applause that I hope to earn, to please hold your applause after I play, because I'm about to play something written by Leonard Cohen. And for Leonard Cohen, music was so much more than entertainment. It was a lifeline, it was prayer, it was speaking to the heart of each precious moment, speaking to the complexity of that word hallelujah, whether it is a word of praise or a word of cold brokenness. So here is Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah.
Thank you. We all want to dissolve. The old Zen monk in red bobble cap and thin glasses tells me with a wry chuckle as he greets me in the chill mountains behind Los Angeles, 300 miles south of Big Sur, where I've come at the end of December. We all need the experience of forgetting who we are. I think that's what love is, forgetting who you are. He flashes a crooked grin. Forgetting who you are is such a delicious experience, and so frightening. Bells toll through the dark, and I hear the sound of clappers. The stooped figure leads me up an unlit path between the trees to the meditation hall. The smell of incense everywhere, as 30 students dressed in black take their seats in rows on either side of a central altar. Not a cough or tremor. When they break, they hasten out into the night and walk in single file between tall pines on the icy ground. Upon their return, to the sound of a pounding drum, they recite the Heart Sutra at lightning speed, its syllables in Japanese, a fusillade of sounds. For 7 days and 7 nights, they'll mostly be sitting in this hall, stepping out occasionally for visits to an outhouse and meals taken swiftly and in silence, mopping the leftovers with tea. In his small cabin, all friends are welcome, says the mat outside. My gracious host, twice the age of most of his comrades, assures me there's nothing special about this training. This cluster of cabins in the high, dark mountains behind LA used to be a Boy Scout camp, though now in his mordant telling, it's a penal colony. Every word and action in the emptiness, decisive as a slash of calligraphy across blank pages. Towards the end of the next day, my guide to Zen practice leads me up, again through great shafts of light between the conifers. The air vibrates with the intensity of silence. We step into the room where the head of the community, a tiny 88-year-old Japanese man in heavy layered robes, is sipping something strong. I came to America to die, the abbot announces. I arrived when I was young, 55. I was fit as a jumping shrimp. He's never bothered to learn much English. Words are needless scratches on the clarity of what lies beyond. I look at the monk who's brought me here. I think of myself at 17 in the little hotel in Bombay, listening over and over to his songs about Marianne and Suzanne and the one who told you when he came he was a stranger. Always in command, on point. And now on this dark mountain, he carries himself like an anonymous grunt, scrubbing floors, cooking for the abbot, driving the old man to the doctor. He has no interest in holy men or golden sentences, he says. He knows how to play that game a little himself. This is simply the most helpful, the most imaginative response to the predicament of life that he has found. Here you find answers, I suggest to Leonard Cohen shortly before I leave. Here you find freedom from answers, he replies, in the grave and gravelly baritone beloved by many. Freedom from questions, a landscape beyond doubt. The songs, I realize as I drive down the mountain, are often about suffering, panic and jealousy and pain. He never pretends he isn't defeated by love and himself and all the ways in which he isn't what he hopes to be. But they're never simply sad. They speak for a struggle in which words like happiness and sadness are beside the point. The only thing you can believe in, he keeps telling me, is a reality you can't comprehend. We're so touched that all of you would be here tonight. I think just about everyone in this room has been through tremendous grief and loss and anxiety and maybe terror these past few weeks. And it means a lot that you would come and share the evening with us. As it happens, this book called Aflame is about the time when I, many years ago, lost my house and everything in the world in a fire. And it's about how, as the years have passed, I found more and more places of hope and restoration. And I don't see it as a complete loss the way I did on the night when everything was reduced to ash. Even before the fires, Vijay and I wanted to do something really special, partly because this is my last night traveling with this book, but much more in honor of this amazing treasure that's been here for more than 130 years, sustaining all of us readers and writers. I think I've presented almost every one of my books here for the last 33 years and hope to keep doing that as long as I possibly can. You know, I've never read from this book before in public, so that too was an unusual precedent for me. In an ideal world, I would be interviewing Vijay. And I think most of you know he's the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant. He was playing with the Israel Symphony Orchestra at the age of 11. He was in college at 13. He spent time at Harvard and Yale. He was at 19 a violinist with the LA Philharmonic, which I think is probably the youngest player ever to be in a Philharmonic orchestra. He's given a celebrated TED Talk, and really, very importantly, in 2010, he founded Street Symphony, and now, full-time, takes his music to Skid Row, to prisons, to jails, and to everywhere where people are in need and suffering, and feels, I think it's a music about healing and about care and about affirmation in many ways. One reason why I was so touched and happy that Vijay would join me today is that he's completing a spiritual memoir, and I am, I think, one of the few people who's been lucky enough to see parts of it, and it's not just eloquent and intelligent and full of his rich story, but it has a whole other dimension. So I'm hoping very soon we'll all get together in Vroman's to listen to Vijay's book. We have only really met in person once before, and that was when I was interviewing Vijay before a large audience in Santa Barbara. But I was especially glad that he could be by my side because he knows the Benedictine hermitage that's at the center of my book, and he's even met the prior, who's in some respects the hero of the book. So thank you for being here, and we'll talk.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Pico. Thank you for that very gracious and very kind introduction. And I just have to say before I continue that the arranger of that beautiful Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen is Rena Esmail, who's here in the room today. And it is because of her and her mother, who happens to be my mother-in-law, that I learned about New Camaldoli, the Benedictine hermitage. And I'm struck by reading this book and recalling the words of the pianist Alfred Brendel, who said that the words listen and silence share the same characters. And that really sitting in silence is sitting in deep listening. And all music comes from that profound capital S silence. And I think that the way that you write about the sort of neurological change, the neurobiological transcendence you experience when you drive up to that beautiful place in Big Sur, you're able to drop in to a place that is not just humming like the trees that you write about, you know, near the monastery that Leonard Cohen was living at near Mount Baldy, but with a kind of receptivity, that there is not just the answers, but the freedom from answers there. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your relationship with New Camaldoli and the role that this place has played in your creative practice for several decades now.
Yeah, too much to say to that. I mean, I'll start just spinning off what you said. I always feel that writing is only deep as the silence that lies beneath it. And I always feel that the beauty of listening is that that's when you learn. As long as you're talking, as I am doing now, you're in some ways projecting your personality. But as soon as you're listening, your personality is left down on the highway. And you're being filled by something probably much more interesting than yourself. So I've always been interested in listening. And therefore very grateful for silence. And it's funny because in this book I make many claims about silence, because one reason I wrote this book was I've never seen our nation and our country and our world as divided as it is right now. And I think we're often divided by our words and our beliefs and our ideologies. And the beauty of silence is that it's on the far side of all of that. I think if all of us start talking, we may quickly be at odds. But if we were joined in a moment of silence, suddenly we'd be united in something much deeper than our words or our assumptions or our preferences. Another reason I wrote it was I've never seen the world as despairing as it is now, even before the recent conflagrations, and it seemed a time to shine a light on people of hope and confidence and strength. And also, of course, we're all in this age of distraction, and I think something in us is longing for whatever lies on the far side of distraction, that lost part of ourself. T.S. Eliot called the life we have lost in living, that we know is there, but we want to recollect. And we sense that driving on the 101 freeway from the bank to the pharmacy is not the whole of the story, but we don't know how to get to the larger part, and traveling to silence has been my way to do it. To answer your question very briefly, as I said, my house burned to the ground. I had nothing in the world but the toothbrush I bought from the all-night supermarket after I drove down from the house, and so I was sleeping on a friend's floor for a long time. And another friend told me about this retreat house 3.5 hours up the coast in Big Sur, California. And all of you know, Big Sur already is a rather unworldly place where the calendar falls away and the outside world and its concerns disappear, and you're in this very intimate landscape that also makes you happily very tiny. Because amidst the tall redwoods and the vast unbroken ocean and those cliffs and the mountains behind you, you're reduced to a speck. And ideally, you're reduced to a drop in the ocean. And you lose your sense of personal identity and become enclosed in something much vaster. And I wasn't that taken by the notion of a retreat house, but then he said, at least you'll have a bed to sleep in, and a big desk, and a private walled garden above the radiant Pacific Ocean, and hot showers, and food for $30 a night. So what was there to lose? And so I ended up, though I'm not a Christian, in this Benedictine hermitage that Vijay knows. And for 33 years, I've stayed there more than 100 times. And the monks have been some of my closest friends in the world at this point. And one of the many things that has inspired me about that, in this world where we cut the world up into what I believe and what you believe, is that they're so open-hearted. And they open their doors and their minds, even to somebody like me who doesn't share their faith. And I often stay with the monks in their enclosure. They're that hospitable and much less dogmatic, I find, than I and many of my friends are. So having gone through 15 years of Anglican schooling in England, I never thought I was in need of more crosses or hymnals. But going there, I found that crosses and hymnals, of course, are not what they're about. They're about charity and compassion and community, essentially.
In fact, there's a really amazing scene in this book where I believe you're at New Camaldoli during Easter, and you're there during the services, and the moment the services start, you find yourself a bit distracted, and that when the services end, that's when the real sacredness begins for you, because you're back in that landscape. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your relationship with the monks and maybe a few of the characters. Of course, the prior Cyprian plays a huge role in this book in terms of not just being the spiritual leader of this place, but frankly, the custodian of this place too. Every character in this book who lives at New Camaldoli is a custodian of the landscape, as well as of their brothers and the land, and the creatures and the trees and everything that's around them. And they've played a profound role in your life.
Yes, I mean, the first thing to say about Cyprian is he is and was a world-class musician, giving concerts everywhere from Jakarta to Beirut to India, which he loves, to Singapore. He's a brilliant writer who's published many books. He runs 7 miles a day. He's one of the more talented people I've ever met. And in some ways, he gave that all up in order to become the prior of this community and live this very difficult life. So, of course, the monks have all given themselves to this life, as you know, for meditation, to be close to their God, to be part of a quiet community. But the prior is the one who spends his whole life dealing with insurance policies and lawyers and construction crews and feuding workers and the rest of it. So nobody really wants to be prior. But to give you a sense of this Camaldoli's congregation, which is the most contemplative order within the Catholic Church, when I go and have dinner with Cyprian in his little cell, on his wall, he has a picture of Jesus in the lotus position. He goes and leads workshops at the Tassajara Zen Center. And in fact, the Camaldoli's monks maintain a Hindu ashram in southern India where the priest actually wears a dhoti, sleeps on the floor, and eats with his hands. And the motto for that ashram is, "We are here to awaken from the illusion of separateness." And in truth, that's the best answer to your first question. If you were to ask me, why do I go there? It's partly to wake up, to be out of my head and come back to my senses. And secondly, to be reminded of the illusion of separateness. When I was driving along the freeway this morning, I was very conscious I was very different from the guy who was cutting me off in the right-hand lane. But when I'm with the monks, all divisions disappear. And then quarrelsome Pico is left down on the highway, which is a great benefit for everybody. And so I was very moved that they would have that as their motto, and then more moved when I found that, as some of you may know, it comes from Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist. And I thought, well, these Catholic monks are really wise and to take their motto from a Vietnamese Buddhist. And as you said so perfectly, the other challenge of being a prior is that he's the father, the mother, and the brother, almost literally, of all the other monks. And of course, one of the challenges of being a monk is you're married to 20 people, 10 of whom you perhaps never want to spend an hour with. Each monk is going to be annoying to some of the others, and yet they're committed to a vow of obedience and to looking after one another, as well as looking after guests such as myself. And all of you in Los Angeles will know how, thanks to these atmospheric storms, 7 of the last 8 years, the Highway 1 has been completely cut off on both sides. So the monks are absolutely isolated. Many of them are elderly, in their 80s, have to be helicoptered out to the nearest hospital in Salinas, 2.5 hours drive away when they get sick. And poor Cyprian, through a secret back road that is only open after dark, drives 5 hours through the night to be by the bedside of his dying brothers, because he's the only family they have, and he, as prior, is responsible for their spiritual and emotional and practical welfare. So just for somebody like me, who's a writer off at my desk, just entertaining my own thoughts, it's so humbling to witness that degree of commitment and service, and as well as that degree of open-mindedness.
There is an artist, a painter, who was one of the monks at New Camaldoli, and he talks about how his craft can actually do something in the world, can serve the world in some way, because I think the question for many of us is that when we are reduced to that speck in this transcendent, turbulent world, we often ask, well, what does any of it matter? What do I matter? What can I do for this world in pain? And oftentimes the immediate answer to us isn't, let's go sit in silence and solitude. And yet there is the wisdom of these monks and the wisdom of this landscape which says that's exactly what you should do. What is the saying? Don't just do something, sit there.
Yes,
right.
yes.
Don't just do something, sit there. And so there's also this sense of obedience, a vow of obedience that I feel you've taken as a creative person, as someone who's dedicated your life. Not that I'm equating you with a monk, because you aren't one, but to say I'm curious to know if you can speak to a little bit about the rigor of your creative practice and what you've learned from these monks, because there's something deeply creative and generative about the way they live. And we know as creative people that creativity requires such exacting discipline.
Beautiful. And you actually remind me, I didn't answer the first part of your question, which had to do with the creative element of being there. And I love what you said at the beginning there, because the music you played and the music that Rena adapted from Leonard Cohen and the song that he created, what greater gift to people, especially when they're in a place of pain or confusion or loss. And that artists are really performing a remarkable service, I think, in the central line of Leonard's song is the cold and broken hallelujah. So he's not taking any shortcuts. He's not pretending that the world isn't difficult, but he's also suggesting that difficulty is not incompatible with joy and wonder and beauty. That the life is a joyful participation in a world of sorrows, as they say in Japan. And to speak to the second part of your question, I suppose, like you and like your wife, I am most a monk when I'm not at the monastery. In other words, when I'm at my desk in Japan, I do have a very, very rigorous practice, so to speak. I've never meditated, but if my wife were here, she'd say, please don't get Pico to meditate. As it is, he's spending 8 hours a day just sitting at his desk trying to see what's on the far side of the thoughts. He doesn't need any more of that. But it is my practice. It is a cabin in the wood. Every morning when I wake up and I go to my desk, and I know you feel the same when you're working with your music, I'm stepping out of the clamor of the world. I'm catching my breath. I'm processing everything I've thought and felt and experienced in the last 24 hours, and I'm readying myself for returning to that turbulent, tumultuous, and imperiled world that you were describing. So I don't think I never worry much what happens to my writing when it goes out into the world, but I do feel it's serving an important function for me, and therefore for everyone who has to suffer through me, like my wife and kids. And they would be
But
probably...
not your readers.
Yes, but a book, as we were saying, takes on a life of its own, and the reader really makes it her own. So I'm offering the beginning of a sentence, and anyone who reads my book is completing it in the context of her life and making it something, I hope, much truer to her than, because I don't know her, but we do have something that we're sharing. And so, as you know, because you're writing a book and completing it, you're trying to find that place where you and the reader meet. But interestingly, the hermitage is the only place in my life where I allow myself not to write. Because I'm sort of freed of my habits, my routines, my daily self. And I just allow intuition and the moment to determine everything I do. So literally, I'll wake up, maybe I'll take a walk now and see the sun rising over the hill. Maybe I'll just sit in the garden and watch the light on the ocean. Maybe I'll pick a book up at random. But I have no agenda. And I never allow myself that freedom, even on a so-called holiday. And that's how it liberates me. So it's the one place I'm scribbling constantly there. But none of that would transmit to an audience because it's too above the clouds and quiet. But it's the one place where I decide what I should write and what I should do. And I think if you were to ask me again, why do you go to this place? I would say to remember what I love. Because I find in my day-to-day life, like most of us, I think I'm doing so many things all at once that I can't sift the trivial from the essential. And as the flames are roaring towards me, literally or metaphorically, I can't put my hand on what's essential, or I can't remember what's most important in my life, because there's too much in my head and too much on my desk. And I thought about this a lot during the pandemic, when suddenly we were all in an enforced retreat, and we were all stilled, and suddenly I think most of us noticed this is what really matters: our family, our friends, gratitude for the fact we're still alive or healthy. So the hermitage is, in that sense, akin to the pandemic, and a way of stepping out of my too speedy and distracted life, so I can see the larger picture.
You write this beautiful phrase where the filaments of yourself are sung whole. Yeah, and it stayed with me, because as you're also looking out at this landscape, which is ever changing, you have so many beautiful ways, some of which are described by the monks, of just describing the water. That the water is satinate one day, or it's silver one day. And every single time we look out at something that we have taken for granted, it shows us something different about itself, but also about us. And so that in that way, it's both a mirror and a lens. It shows us something about ourselves that we would never have known was there if we hadn't just stopped and paid that currency of attention.
Currency of attention, yes. And therefore it's a way of dealing with impermanence and uncertainty, which is something we all have to face. And as you say, the ocean at some level is always the same, and at the same time it's always different.
You do write about love in this book. I think you have this beautiful phrase that love shows one the structure of the universe, in a sense. And you also write about loss. And there is this moment where Leonard Cohen is sitting with his teacher, weeping in the hospital room, and to see this great, huge, tall, gravelly voiced artist weeping like a child. It sort of also reminds us of that constant through line touch point of fragility. And of course, we are always living in a landscape that is that fragile as well. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that meeting point, that liminal space where, because we're worried, because we're paying attention to the impermanence, we are that much closer to the end.
Beautiful. I mean, there is a lot of death in this book, and it's a book about joy. And so how do you bring those into the same sentence? And how do you have the confidence to live when you know that everything you love is at some point going to leave you, or you're going to leave it first? And I remember soon after I began staying at the Hermitage, my father suddenly went into the hospital and never emerged. He died. And so I'm an only child, and so my mother was grieving, and I had to look after her, and had to write the obituary and plan the memorial service and deal with the condolence calls and inform friends and family around the globe. It was really, really a busy time. And I was thinking, how do I deal with this sudden house call from reality? And I realized the only way was one day when my mother was well taken care of, to drive 3.5 hours up the coast and just sit on a bench in the road. And as you said, watch the bees in the lavender, watch the rabbit in the undergrowth, look at the ocean, hear the tolling bells, and see this is something that's going to outlast my hopes. This is something that's going to endure for a long, long time. And insofar as we're a drop in the ocean, the consolation of that is the ocean is going to last for centuries, even if you and I do not. And so just seeing something that seems to live outside the world of change makes change much less frightening and makes the fact of loss, which all of us have to deal with, a little less intimidating than it might be.
When we have these moments of perhaps revelation or these touchstones where we remember, it's like a kind of both remembering of the memory, but remembering of we are putting ourselves back together.
Yes.
You write about how Wittgenstein at the end of his life talks about how once you have experienced that, the work now is to not turn away.
Yes.
That relapse is so easy.
Yes.
So how do we not cut that person off on the 101?
Yes, I did. and I will tomorrow too, don't worry.
I will not take the 101 tomorrow.
So when I'm there for 3 days, I find for 1.5 days, after I return home, I'm walking on air. And my friends don't recognize me. And then soon I'm fretting over my tax return and worried why my editors asked for the 11th rewrite of that article. But I think cumulatively, over 33 years and 100 retreats, something changes. It's like the 10,000-hour rule, which I think you know well and exemplify. Whether one's meditating or whether one's playing music, there are never sudden transformations, but incrementally, slowly. You know, I was lucky to meet the Dalai Lama the day after he won the Nobel Prize. He was down in Newport Beach. And all the Tibetans and people who care about Tibet were celebrating. Our problems are over. The Dalai Lama, being a realist, said, no way, I really wonder if I've done enough. This was in 1989. But he said, all I can do is try my best day after day after day. And at the end of it, I hope something will come of it. And I love what you said about recollection, because that speaks for that sense, as you said, not just that all the scattered parts of ourselves are brought together in a single whole, which I feel very much there, but also it speaks to some memory. In other words, that part of us that recalls or intimates that there's something beyond what we see. And there's a fullness in us and a truth to reality beyond the reality that is our daily lives. That's what you recall there. So the monks, too, never speak about great discovery or revelation. It's recollection of something that we all share and knew. And you're opening so many doors with each question. I have 100 things to say, and I have to contain myself. No, please open some more. But don't drive on the 101 tomorrow.
No, yeah. That I won't. No, I you know, there's so many places where this conversation can go, and you know, and we have talked about faith and hope before, and I think oftentimes hope can feel like a weighted blanket we don't need right now. You know, it's the kind of thing where it's kind of placed on us as an obligation, especially in a time when so many of us are grappling with such tremendous loss and brokenness, and yet there is the real practice of faith, the practice of forgetting to even seek the answers.
Yes.
And I wonder if the turning away that Wittgenstein is talking about, or that the monks practice, or that you experience every time you go back to New Camaldoli, that you so beautifully encapsulate in your writing, is the sustaining of that moment of remembering, the moment of knowing, that we're writing ourselves into being over and over again, as Toni Morrison said, that your narrative is radical because we are being composed while we're writing, you know, and so the book writes us, we are being written at the same time. And so if perhaps we are meditating and contemplating upon wholeness, we are somehow engendering that within ourselves in some way.
Yeah, well, I love also the fact that you invoke love, because I think most of us in this room have probably fallen in love with mixed results. But when you fall in love and it's something true, there are always going to be absences, frustrations, and differences, but you're there for the long haul, and you have the faith that this was the right choice and was the right choice for your partner, and by having that faith, you make it true. I was very touched to hear that Pope Francis, when he prays, doesn't pray for answers. He prays for the courage to live with answerlessness, which is probably the state in which most of us have to spend our days. Again, I quote in this book Václav Havel, who, speaking of hope, says hope isn't the belief that everything is going to turn out okay and there'll be a happy ending, but it is the belief that there's something that makes sense. It's not a sense that we can understand necessarily, but there is a larger order to things. He would believe, and others of faith would believe. William James said most of us are like dogs in a library. There's incredible wisdom all around us. We just don't have the capacity to see it. But that doesn't mean the wisdom isn't there. The failing is in us, not in. And I was very touched. When I completed the book, some of the monks in the book and in my life come to my trailer, and they share with me all the fears and doubts and frustrations they entertain, because it's like 40 days and nights in the wilderness, but they're spending 40 years in the wilderness, and they're alone in their cell with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. And some of them have seen God, and they make this vow of obedience, and then maybe they never see God again, like Mother Teresa, or they're waiting and waiting and waiting for years. And it's a very hard and rigorous practice, of course. And so when I completed the book, I sent it to two of them because I didn't want to presume upon their anonymity, and they live private lives, and I didn't want to get things wrong or say things I shouldn't. And instantly, both of them wrote back to me and said, don't change a word. And the one who'd really shared all his frustrations with me said, remember, it's our brokenness that's the main thing we have to share with people. It's the fact that we don't have answers. We're not above the clouds. We're mortal and fallible, and we're stumbling through the dark too, wrestling with all the things that every one of our visitors and every human does. That's our offering to the world. And that was very touching to hear, that they would throw their arms around their imperfection. I must say, going there was about stripping away from myself all my illusions about monks. And one of them was that they're the opposite of pious, the ones I know. They're not holier than thou. It's people like me who go on retreat who end up holier than thou. They're much more down to earth than most of us. They're deeply grounded because they're working around the clock to look after one another and to sustain their visitors. And I'm glad you bring in Leonard too, because one of the things I try to do in this book is incorporate Buddhist monks like the Dalai Lama and Leonard Cohen, a Zen abbess from San Francisco, a Hindu nun. In other words, people from many orders to say none of this is particular to this place or these people, but it is maybe a function of this life. And I realized when I first went there, naively, in my early 30s, I thought, I want to learn how to live. And I figured these guys have their priorities very clear, and they've let go of their ego, and they're in service, and it's very moving and instructive to be with them. And then, having gone there in search of solitude and beauty and a bed to sleep in, I realized, actually, watching them, this is a place where I'd learn how to love. And then, later on, I realized, as with all monastics, this is a place where I learn to die. The classic monk has a skull on his desk. And then I thought, no, it's actually about that even harder thing, about, as you said, what to do when all your brothers are dying, how to tend to the dying. And I love the fact that you single out that moment, just not far from here, in Mid-Wilshire district, when I was with Leonard Cohen, and his 107-year-old teacher was on his last night of life before his death. And Leonard turned to me and he said, that's what the whole practice is about, cleaning the bottom of your teacher when he's incontinent, taking him to the bathroom if he can't manage himself. That's why I've put in 5.5 years as a monk. Has not, in his reading, had nothing to do with being more enlightened, getting rid of his problems, writing better. It was just about learning how to care. And that, too, was such a startling thing to register.
Wow.
You're the one who singled out that moment, and I'm glad you did.
Well, I'm thinking about the way that Leonard Cohen's monastic name, which is the word jikan. And the characters for the word jikan in Japanese, I believe, are the same for the word time.
Yes.
But it's a slightly different meaning
Yes.
for Leonard Cohen's monastic name, and I wonder if you can speak to that.
Yes,
I
I
don't know
mean,
him.
in brief, he was the most articulate writer I've ever met, a real wizard of words, as is evident from all his songs and poems, and would just talk spellbindingly over lunch about the journey of the soul and literature and his life in Cuba and his time in Greece and everything else. And yet, his wise Japanese teacher gave him the monastic name Jikan, which in this context means the silence between two thoughts. And Leonard Cohen, the most eloquent person I've met, was essentially a connoisseur of silence, much like Thomas Merton, the most prolific writer. And so when friends would visit Leonard Cohen, they would often, as I did, find themselves just sitting next to him. No words at all. And that's why in that little passage I read, I mention of his teacher, this teacher who lived in this country for more than 50 years, or roughly 50 years, never really tried to learn English, because he knew that the silence that they would share be much more profound than any words that they could exchange. And when I went to Leonard Cohen, his very modest house in a very unfashionable part of LA, the first time, and he put 2 chairs down and we just sat there and sat there and sat there with no words. After a while, I realized that was the greatest act of trust and friendship he could offer to me. His words he shares beautifully with the world. But this was where he was trying to show, get us as close as we could.
Wow.
And we all know that when we're in love. I mean, when you're in love with somebody, the least important thing are the words you share. And the most important are the silences. And the more and the longer you love that person, the more you can communicate almost entirely with silence, or certainly beautifully with silence.
Some of the most sacred moments I've ever experienced with people has been the moment right after a piece of music ends. And you're sitting in the hall, and the entire Mahler symphony has happened in those 30 seconds after the last note has died away. And it almost feels as if the entire symphony was written for that moment.
I felt that after you finished Hallelujah. It was when you stopped and you stood there, suddenly we were all joined in our deepest part. I felt that, yeah. I thought you were going to quote Miles Davis, famously saying that the music is in the space between the notes, but it comes to the same thing, I think.
Well, you mentioned Merton, and of course it's a quote of Merton which became the title of this book.
Yes.
And how in Contemplation, I think it's quoting the Desert Fathers, that
Yes.
one can become a flame.
Yes.
And that one's attention is in and of itself that elemental force, which can go unchecked to cause unbelievable havoc,
Yeah.
which I think our world is experiencing in so many ways, but can also be channeled. And I'm thinking about the firefighters who talk about talking to the flames and having conversations with the flames and doing controlled burns. It's almost a dance with the wind and the flame. And so I wonder about what practices we can establish in our lives, and perhaps this is a way to open up your attention and questions in the room, perhaps, about what do we do with this time where the fire is still burning in us, especially for us in this community. I'm so grateful to be here where I have spent more Christmas shopping money than one could possibly imagine. This is my bookstore. This is my community. And to know that there is a part of us which is still in shock. And yet, what is the opportunity of this moment? Not the silver lining, but the opportunity to sit with what burns in us and not let it burn us, not let it scald us, but let it create some new life within us. And I wonder about the power of the creative act and the necessity of the creative act in this moment right now as we literally rebuild communities. And you have given us such a tremendous gift in the whole body of your work over so many decades. It's just to say thank you to you, Pico, but also for the way in which you have done it, which has never felt like you are inflicting yourself on us, but simply inviting us into that contemplative space. And so I don't even know if there's a question in there, but it's just to say thank you.
I'll take it as a question.
I'm curious.
Yes, yeah. I mean, first you began with Merton,
Yeah.
who said wonderfully, there's more substance to silence than to the answer of any question. And who also said beautifully, when your mind is completely silent, then the forest suddenly becomes magnificently real, which is what I was trying to say at the outset. And to speak to what you were saying about fire, my family home is still in the hills of California, and we still know that fire is nature's Easter. It's we need that landscape, needs fire. Pine trees and meadow and manzanita cannot survive without fire. So if we can't live without fire, as you were saying, how do we live with fire? I just recently read Jung writing the difference between a good life and a bad life is how we walk through the fire. Because as you said, fire is a metaphor for sudden death, a car crash, an earthquake, a tsunami, all the many things every one of us has to deal with. And how do we maintain hope and clarity in the midst of that? I was just talking to a young writer who lost everything at the Malibu fire. And she's putting together a whole issue of her magazine called Panifold, talking to people who've been through this experience before. And as we were talking, and she was, of course, in a very distraught state, I was suddenly remembering that on the night when I lost everything, all I could see was loss. And half a lifetime later, I've seen how many doors it's opened. The doors it closed were very visible, but the doors that were opening were gradual, but inarguable. I mean, it liberated me in all kinds of ways, to write in a different way, to live more simply, to remember what was really important, to take certain precautions like keeping my handwritten notes in a bank instead of where they could be reduced to ash. But now, at this point, I wouldn't say that it was a calamity. I would say it was a dramatic wake-up call for me. And luckily, at the age of 33, I was able more to begin again than my mother, who was 59, who was stripped of all her past and everything she loved. And she probably felt it was too late for her to begin again. So it takes many, many different forms. But you were saying how playing music and writing, in some ways you're being written. In other words, things come through you that you would never have guessed you have inside yourself. And I think each of us has a wisdom inside ourselves that takes us by surprise. And so I see a friend here who knows exactly the same poem that we often quote. When finally, after 3 hours being stuck in the middle of the fire, I drove to my friend's house. Before I went to sleep, I asked if I could use her computer, because in those long ago days, my job was to be a columnist for Time magazine, and I used to write the back page essay, and I just had an eyewitness view of what was then the worst fire in Californian history. So I immediately went to the computer and I wrote up the day as I remembered it. And at the end, without thinking, which is the great blessing, I remembered a poem that I'd run into because I'd been spending time in Japan from the 17th century, I believe, from Masahide, who said, "My house burnt down, I can now see better the rising moon." So even the very evening when I'd lost everything, including my next 3 books, my next 8 years of writing, something in me sensed, don't simplify this into just a loss. You can't see what's been lost or gained for many, many years to come. And maybe it will help you concentrate more on what is really important. That's a really difficult way to learn it. And terrible adjustment of staying in an apartment for 3.5 years and dealing with the insurance companies and moving into a beautiful new house that was entirely empty. But that was only just one half of the equation, and there's so many others that it pushed me towards the places I needed to be and the people I needed to be with. So, all my writing, again and again, my wife calls me a stuck record because I just write the same book again and again and pretend, put on different clothing. Sometimes there's a T-shirt, sometimes there's a jacket, but it's always the same story, and it's all about balancing hope and realism, seeing the world as it is, but never giving up on it, because to give up on it is to give up on life. And
well, perhaps how we are the same soul reincarnated in the clothing of this body.
every 3 years or something, in my case, yeah.
Well, the fact that we are together means that we can have a little bit of a conversation, as much as I would like to continue talking to you for absolutely forever. So we have some time, I think about 10 minutes or so, for some questions from the audience. I'm happy to repeat them from here, so the room hears it through a microphone. But if anyone has any questions.
Yes, please. Hi.
I have a writerly question.
Please. Good, because I was going to talk about writerliness.
How do you remember all this stuff?
Aha. Luckily, I have an answer, not a difficult one. Well,
Because the detail is so powerful.
just this. And taking it down then and there, not waiting for 20 minutes. Because right now, I can see exactly the pink of that jacket, and I can see exactly how the light is highlighting Educate at the back of this room, and I can feel and smell this room. And 20 minutes after I leave, it'll be gone, the way a dream vanishes instantly. So, because this is so portable, you could do the same with an iPhone, I'm sure, scribbling it down then and there. Enough for me to be able to reconstruct when I go back to my hotel at the end of the evening. One thing I did, because Vijay opened a wonderful door that I walked blindly past earlier, but in putting this book together, you know, for those who are interested in writing, one of the challenges was after 33 years of going there, I had 4,000 pages that I was trying to distill into a book as short as possible, because I wanted it to be like a haiku. And a haiku is deeply personal, but it's not smudged by personality. It's not about the person writing. It's about his or her opening up to something we all share. And so one thing I was trying really hard to do was make it very, very slow, to rescue the reader from the rush of the world and to take her closer to what she feels she's missing in her everyday life. A little bit akin to whisking her up to Big Sur, and then trying to take the clutter out so that it's almost a series of parables. So, as you've had to read the whole thing, there is a narrative arc, and there are 5 sections, and there's a story I'm developing. But at the same time, my hope is you could pick it up at any point if you're feeling stressed, and just read a page, and it might calm you down and cool you down and offer a kind of medicine. I mean, I'm not enthusiastic about promoting my own books, but I was in the Bay Area a few days ago, and there was a 84-year-old bookseller whom I respect a lot, and she said, you know, the funny thing is, every time I read your book, I was checking my blood pressure, and it went down by 10 points. And I said, great, they'll sell it from CVS from now on. But that's not guaranteed, but I guess it was my hope that...
But I think it also creates that space where the reader meets you.
That's the silence and the white space.
And
Yeah.
that does speak to the masterful writerliness of this book, because you are met immediately and you're able to have the sentence live its way through you. And you have created as much the space around the sentences as the sentences themselves.
Yes, lots of pauses, lots of white spaces. And I think also, you know, the great Los Angeles writer Christopher Isherwood wonderfully said that the ego is like a guy who insists on standing right in front of you at a horse race. He's coming between you and all the excitement of life. And so when you go to any place where you feel that you're less captive to your ego, there's this beautiful, vivid transparency in some ways. And so the hope for a writer is to get himself out of the way so that, as you say, he is meeting. He's not coming between himself and the reader, and it's so easy to do that. He's not performing. He's disappearing into the reader in some ways. And as you said, and as I was saying earlier, the reader really is writing the book. And there's enough space for her to take this little germ of a suggestion or a haiku and make of it what she wants and translate it into her own life.
Beautiful. Other questions? In the back, please.
Yeah, you said something about accepting death. What did you...
Not accepting death.
how to understand death or something like that? Well, I can't remember exactly what you
Yeah.
said. What was that? What is your explanation of death? How to accept it? Or...
Yeah, I don't think I have an explanation or a way of accepting it, but living with reality. I mean, I feel any time I argue with reality, it's an argument I'll lose. And if I pretend I'm not going to die, it's going to take me by surprise, which isn't going to be a good thing at all. And I prepare so hard for my driving test, for my job interview, or for a first date. Probably I could use some of that energy preparing to die. because that's the moment where one's life is determined to some extent. So I don't know anything about accepting death. But I think what I was also trying to say is we all have to deal with impermanence, loss constantly. So how do we stay calm in the midst of it? Sorry.
Didn't you say the monks taught you how to accept it?
Yeah, well, learning from them how to die, yes, as you said, which means not pretending it's not going to happen and thinking about it and preparing it, and also working hands-on with the people who are falling away around you. And then when I was talking about going up there when my father died, it was just grounding myself in something that's not as brief as I am, so that impermanence becomes a little less scary. I'm not going to be around probably for many more years, but Romans probably is, and the Pacific Ocean certainly is, and so I get a kind of sustenance from that.
So come to your bookstore is what. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
One more question.
I would
let's
ask.
go
You
here.
can ask
Yeah,
it
yeah,
later.
yeah.
See, yeah.
Please.
Well, this whole idea of like, kind of the nothingness, the spaces where you're quiet, when you're talking about dealing with reality too, those two things are really incompatible because the only reason I ever want anything is because the world wants stuff from me. The world doesn't want stuff from me, I'm cool. So how do you merge the two things? And I'm a creative too. I've been, what I like to say is straight out of high school to the pros. So I've done this my whole life, but in the end, there is no nothingness. The only time I'm actually loved or useful is when you want something from me. And then all of a sudden you really like it. Because I'm delivering something you really think you can use, and then it's good. But when that's over, then I'm nothing again. And so for me, if I didn't have to do anything, great. But there's always, give me money. And so there is no quiet for me actually, because that's the reality. Does that make any sense to you?
Thank you. I mean, as you were talking, I was speaking of the gift Vijay shared with us. I don't think any of us came to Vroman's expecting to hear a beautiful violin. And none of us asked him to do it. And he, out of himself, his grace, just gave us this gift. And I don't think, and therefore we will emerge from this evening not thinking he's nothing. But there's really something, because he's given us something. In terms of silence and reality, I think I was trying to say, not very clearly, that sometimes I feel that paying my taxes and driving on the 101 and going to the CVS is real life. And when I step away and I see a larger picture, it kind of jolts me out of that. And I see, oh, well, there's probably a reality beyond the one that I can recognize, and that's the one I have more trust in. And it's almost like, we all put masks on to play the social game. We all have social selves. But we have a silent self that is much deeper and more trustworthy. And as long as I can reclaim that silent self, it reminds me not to take the social self or the social world too seriously. I think there may be some music on the way.
I'll just end with a little tune by George Friedrich Handel. And I'm just to give a point to your question, there is an amazing book written by a Hardanger, a Norwegian violinist named Knut Hamre, who talks about how all music making is, in fact, to become nothing again. So that is actually what we are all striving for in some way.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Oh, what a treat. I didn't recognize the beginning of that encounter.
Yes.
Then halfway through.
It just grows, yeah.
Wow.